Epilogue. I traveled day and night the first 2 days. Cautiously, I avoided any evidence of man while heading north. The experiences of the past 7 years had taught me where I was supposed to go. Before reaching that final destination, there were stops that needed to be made. For more than 2 weeks, mountains to the east forced me to continue north. Daily ascent to high ground gave me a lay of the eastern landscape. Eventually, the Appalachian Mountains, as I learned later the locals called them, slid away, and I pushed on northward until finding the southern shores of the great lake Jean-Luc Claude and I had discovered years earlier. My path was now east where there were debts to pay. Eventually, small settlements began to pop up. At first, the settlers had no knowledge of the town called Bickford. Soon, I was directed northeast by some kindly folk who seemed familiar with the town. After finding Bickford, locating Amos Perkins and his wife proved easy. The kind farmer and his kin still lived in the clearing they had years earlier. They didn't recognize me at first, being scruffier and fully grown. As soon as I brought up the late-night intrusion, they remembered the whole story in detail without being reminded. Amos was instantly apologetic for the beating the men had inflicted. I interrupted. My purpose here is not to get an apology, but to make amends for a debt I owe you. The kindness your family showed me despite the circumstances of our acquaintance taught me a great deal. He refused my request to repay him with a week's labor at first, but seeing my commitment, or maybe recognizing my need to make amends, he agreed. At the end of a week we shook hands, shared in a drink, and parted ways. Upon departure, I headed due east in search of the farmer whose rifle and other materials I had stolen. My vague recollection of the landscape and event made the search a failure. A few days later, after years of conflicted dreams about the moment, the town of Roxbury came into sight. Despite some fear of being arrested, I strode head up through the center of town and wordlessly headed toward my parents' house on the outskirts of town. Curious glances were cast my way, as they are with any stranger, but there seemed to be no signs of recognition. The homecoming was far better than expected. My mother sprinted from the house and up the road past my father, who was working near the barn, as soon as I came into sight. She would tell us later she recognized my walk even from a great distance. Father followed slowly, curiously after her, and didn't start moving with urgency until Mother and I embraced. To my surprise, Father joined in the happy reunion with tears in his eyes. We spent the rest of the late fall day feasting while both insisted on hearing every detail of the nearly 7 years of adventure. It was very rewarding to see the amazement and admiration in both of their eyes. Though smiling, tears streamed down my mother's face when I showed them my scarred back and mutilated left hand that had gripped the sword blade while saving the Spanish surveyor Gaspar Odalis. 2 of my fingers still refused to work properly. Being there, safe in the moment, brought an appreciation of the fact that some greater power had made it possible to finally be home. My parents sent for my brother Micah, who now had a wife and his own piece of land nearby. He arrived with his wife and 2 young children. He embraced me without reservation, and the tale was retold to the new listeners, who sat in joyful anticipation of each new chapter. Micah would later make great sacrifices to encourage and help me write the story down. Reverend Washburn had long since been reassigned. My parents were not sure what would happen if my presence was discovered. There was surely some who still blamed me for the sickness years earlier. My parents prodded about a plan for the future. I assured them there was a plan, but was intentionally vague. Father reminded me of how headstrong I had been, but marveled at how much the years had changed me. He joked about how determined Washburn was to save my troubled soul. As if the man had never seen a spirited young man before, he snickered. I knew you wouldn't stay put in that holding cell. The comment brought back the memory from years before of the piece of flint and sharp metal that had first inspired thoughts of escape. the gift I had always assumed Mother was responsible for. "I knew you would know what to do," he smiled. It was embarrassing to remember the amount of times I had cursed this man over the last 7 years. He was the one who had believed in me most. At the end of the second day, just as my mind was spinning around the complexity of arranging a safe meeting with Abigail Reed, a lone figure strode up the road to my parents' cabin just before sunset. As Abigail came into view, my parents looked on with surprise, apparently still unaware of our secret friendship. "Miss Reed and I have some unfinished business to discuss," I said over my shoulder while creeping hesitantly down the steps and seeking a private conference with her. The door to the cabin closed quietly behind me as I strode forward. Many times over the last 7 years I had dreamed of this moment. Never once had I imagined her coming to seek me out. The anticipated fear of the moment was missing, replaced by a feeling of relief. No matter how this meeting turned out, simply making it here was a great success. Many times in the last 7 years, the perils surrounding me had brought doubt of this meeting ever taking place. As she came closer, finally the expression on her face was visible. Abigail was even more beautiful than memories had served, and she wore a bright smile. "2 days since you walked through town and no visit," she playfully scolded. "I was beginning to think my eyes had deceived me. Then I recalled that it had always been I who sought you out. Where did you go? Where have you been these long years?" And so the long story was told again to Abigail as the sun set on a cool fall evening. She reacted just as the others had, amazed and full of questions. Upon conclusion of the story, staring into her eyes, I let my vulnerability show. "You were with me the whole time. Whenever danger approached, starvation loomed, death stalked, the thought of this moment kept me going. The thought of this moment gave me hope." She cried. Tears of happiness, tears of joy ran down her face. She explained that her parents had tried to make her marry years before. Many suitors had come to call, but she had stubbornly refused. Her father blamed it on the fierce independence she had shown since childhood, never suspecting that it was her commitment to a lost love. She had been waiting, believing deep in her heart that I was alive and would come back someday. With eyes full of curiosity, she asked what came next. I told her about the land in the foothills where the Frenchman had taken me years before on the first trapping excursion to the mountains. The feelings and the dreams the hills had inspired in me. Her eyes filled with hope when she heard about the dream where she held our child. She insisted that we leave before sunup the next morning. She refused to return home. She had snuck out of her parents' home after going to bed early with a fake illness. She was afraid they would force her to stay. My parents had reservations at first, but soon admitted to uncertainty over what would transpire if the whole town knew of my return. Abigail had come with nothing, so Mother sacrificed all she could to start us on our way. We left before the sun rose the next morning. The excitement in Abigail's face relieved me of any doubt. It was as if she had waited for this moment her whole life. I knew exactly how that felt. We did not go directly to the foothills, as it was too late in the fall. We stayed the winter with the kind Amos and Mercy Perkins, who received us enthusiastically, before moving on in the spring. We lived out our days in that special place I had discovered with the French fur trappers, Jean-Luc and Claude. We built our home, raised many children, and heard the music together.